So a little over 2 years ago, I released Saunter, and when I first released it, it did all right. It got a couple thousand plays on SoundCloud and maybe 200 or something likes. But it stayed pretty consistent in growth until August of 2019, when, as I'm sure many of you know, Knots released his Geometry Dash level Event Boundary. And when that happened, Saunter started to grow really, really quick. And now it's my most played song across all streaming platforms, so thank you guys for that. But basically, as Saunter has continued to grow, I've had more and more people commenting or messaging me about how I made it. So that's what we're going to do in this video. I'm just going to break down the project file for Saunter, tell you what I did, and yeah, let's get into it. So I'm not going to go over every nitty-gritty detail because that would make this video way too long. I'm just going to go over some of the most important stuff that you guys are probably the most interested in. And you're probably not super interested in like the intro and stuff, so I'll go over it pretty quickly. We have, to begin, the piano, of course, which is an Addictive Keys piano, which I don't really use Addictive Keys anymore, but it came free with my MIDI keyboard that I got for Christmas a few years ago, so I used it here. Then I also have some ambience here. This ambience, there's a couple different layers. There's a cashmere ambience, which is very quiet. Can't really hear it. And there's a cave ambience. This one's pretty cool. And this is probably the most important one. It's a vocal ambience, or not really an ambience. It's more of just a vocal from the Murtaugh sample pack. And I changed the pitch here. And it just kind of plays a melody. And I also have this ambience kind of rise in here. I believe this is a Virtual Riot ambience. Yeah, it is. This Virtual Riot ambience pack is really old, but I still use some of the ambiences because they're pretty nice. And then I also have a clock ticking here. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that section. I think I'll move on to right here. I kind of introduced this ARP that plays on the piano as well as up here. A much more electronic sound, just like a pitched square. And I also have the same thing going on right here, except I have a low pass filter on it that gradually eases up so you can start to hear the sound and then it goes away again. It sounds like this. So that's that, and it continues to do that throughout this section. So that's pretty much it for that section. Now I'm going to go to the build-up.
When you travel, you are trying to get somewhere.
So this section is really what started the song. This whole song started around the idea of this Alan Watts speech.
When you travel, you are trying to get somewhere.
I got this idea after listening to Overthinker by Enzo, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard. It's a pretty popular song, definitely the most popular electronic song that uses an Alan Watts sample, and from that a lot of other people had followed suit, and I just thought it was a really cool idea, so I decided to do it here. I basically just took the speech that he made and I added some effects to it, like some bit crushing. Without any effects, it sounds like this.
When you travel, you are trying to get somewhere.
But then throw the effects on.
When you travel, you are trying to get somewhere.
So that bit crushing doing a lot of work there. And then I just chopped it up and I made sentences that I liked. This isn't even really what the original sounds like. I removed a lot of excess talking and I just made it kind of coherent with the song. So that's what I did with that. I also have this ARP, which sounds like this. So basically, the ARP kind of acts as the build-up just to this note. This note is kind of the main point. But then you have the build-up which leads into it. So that was kind of my thought process there. And then I have a couple saws here which have the high end cut out of them. But as you can see, the low pass filter is gradually easing up so you can hear more of the high end as the build continues. I also have these drum hits. These cashmere samples are nice. I use a lot of cashmere samples, especially for like impacts and stuff. He has a lot of really nice impacts in this pack. So this is what this sounds like. And it goes like that as the build-up continues. I also have this crash, which gets louder and louder. Along with the kick. So for the second half of the build, I introduced the lead, which is something that I do quite a bit. I like to introduce an element of the drop in my build-up, so it's kind of familiar. So I have the lead that comes in the second half of the build. And notice how it's not the first melody that you hear in the drop. The first melody sounds like this. But the lead is like this. So that melody is from the second part of the drop, the second half. And why did I do that? I don't really know, I just felt like it. But that's pretty much it for the build. Let's get on to the drop. So the drop is really basic, it's really simple. And a lot of people ask me, you know, how do I make the saw stacks or drops like Saunter or whatever. And it's really pretty straightforward. So I'll break it down starting with the drums, which are the simplest part probably. It's just a kick, snare, and crash. Nowadays I use a lot more elements in my drums, but you know, back then this got the job done. Here's what it sounds like. So one thing I want to point out about this is this little tom fill. So this is something that I do a lot. I'll take some toms, these for example are from the Akali pack, and what I'll do is I'll slap some redux on them, which is just bit crushing for those of you who don't use Ableton, and I just increase the downsampling amount. Without the bit crushing it sounds like this. That kind of sucks. So that's why I have the bit crushing. Just a cool effect. Moving on to the synths, the saws, and one thing that I want to say off the bat, one misconception that I want to establish is that, you know, a lot of people think that because they're called saw stacks, the saws are the most important thing, which really, in my opinion, is not true. The most important thing is your low end, which we will get to in a sec. So the first saw layer sounds like this. So the most important thing here is going to be the Saturn. Saturn is a saturation plugin, and you can see which sections, it's like an EQ almost, but you can EQ with saturation. So I'm boosting a lot of the mids and some of the high mids. The highs I leave untouched because I don't like super harsh highs, but the high mids I boost and the mids I boost for sure. Next I have this clean saw. And you can see that this one's not being saturated at all, and the patch itself, the detune is pretty low compared to, say, the first one, where you can see the detune for the main oscillator is at about halfway. For this clean saw, the oscillators are only at about 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Next I have these low saws, which as the name implies, just meant to be a little bit of low end. Typically you want to save your low end for more bassy elements, but I just like to include this low to mid heavy area. I just thought that sounded nice. Next I have this vocal saw, which really is not a saw at all. It's just a vocal. It's the same vocal that I used in the intro here, this A sample. I took that sound and I threw it into a simpler, and then I have it on loop mode, and it sounds like this. Now the effects here are really important. Without the effects, it sounds like this. Which honestly still sounds pretty good, but you can see the theme here. I use a lot of bit crushing. But when I add the bit crushing, it gets a bit harsh, so I do some EQing. And some more EQing. And that's that sound. That's just a nice layer on top. So next I have this lead, which sounds like this. And you might notice that this is actually the same patch as the ARP. But you might be thinking to yourself, that sounds kind of different. This one sounds very wobbly. And this one sounds very clean. You know? So what I did to do that was, you can see I have this little itty bitty automation. It goes from 0.5 to 0.51. What that automation does is, if I open up Silent here, I'm automating this knob right here. It's a pitch knob, and it's on an LFO. So when I automate this pitch knob up just a little bit, then this pitch is going to be LFO'd very fast, and that's where I get that sound from. So the next sound is the lead, which sounds like this. So the main idea here is the pitch bend and the vibrato. And you can see here, when I pull up the automations for the pitch bend and the vibrato, what I'm doing a lot of the time is, when I have a pitch bend like this, right after that, it'll lead into a vibrato. I also do it up here and over here. That one's just a bit longer, and that's kind of the pattern I go for here. And that's what I do with that lead throughout the drop. So next I have the bass, and the bass is where your beef is going to come from, really. The most important thing is having a good mid bass. Now this mid bass is made in Operator. I actually did not make it, an old friend of mine made it, and I used it for this track. And it sounds like this. And then below that I just have a sub. And then when you put them together, now the bass is just so important. It doesn't sound like a ton just playing them on their own, but if I were to play the drop without the bass, it would sound like this. It's a disaster. So that's why we gotta have a nice sub and a nice mid layer. You can really hear the difference, and you can hear that mid bass coming through. It does so much for the sound. So below the bass, I have these two miscellaneous sounds that just fill up space throughout the drop. This first one is a crowd sample, and I still use this technique to this day. A lot of this stuff I don't really do anymore, just because I made this song, as I said, over 2 years ago, and I've changed a lot as a producer in those 2 years. But this crowd sample technique I still use in every single track and all the drops. The crowd just sounds like this. It just fills up so much noise, and it's so nice. And below that I use a white noise layer. And that's it for the first drop. Let's continue on to the break. So a couple main ideas here. One of the main sounds kind of driving this section is the clock. And that's just a grandfather clock, and I put some delay and some reverb on it. Another main idea is this vocal sample right here. And I do a similar thing that I did with the other vocal sound, where I have it just going like in a melody. So I have this piano, and it starts off clean like a normal piano, but I'm automating the bit crushing, and you can hear it here. It gets more and more bit crushed as time goes on, and I really like this sound, but I don't get too carried away. I leave it at like 2.6. I figured this was kind of enough bit crushing, because if I got more than that, it just became kind of over the top. That's pretty much it for that section. I'll move on to the second half of the break, where I have some pretty interesting percussion going on. It sounds like this. So let's just break it down. I have the kick, and I have this snare, which I have like a fake delay effect going on. They just duplicated it and made it quieter. I also have this reverb tail, which just gets louder into the next snare hit. It's kind of a nice effect that I use on a lot of my sounds. I also have this cashmere snare, which is a lot quieter. It sounds like this. The point of this snare is just to play in conjunction with the main snare, just to give it some support and a little more detail in the whole percussion sound. And down below I have 2 percussion loops. One of them is from Summit. And then the other loop sounds like this. Together like that. And aside from those percussions, not much is different. Pretty much the same as that prior section. So let's move on to the second build.
You pay for this increased survival ability.
So here I pitched up the piano, or rather I didn't pitch it up, but I removed the low end, because before it sounded too intense, and I wanted this part to be a lot more calming, a lot more like pretty almost. So I cut out that low end and made it a lot more soft. And then as we get into the actual build, it gets a little more intense.
Might happen tomorrow.
You can hear the kick come in, as well as some saws, as well as the vocal saw, which again is not a saw, the lead, and then this new lead, which is going to be introduced for the first time in the Drought. And then moving on from there, we can get into the Drought. The drums are pretty much the same. The only difference is that I have some hi-hats. So the most important thing with this second drop is this new lead. Again, the most important thing, the bit crushing. Without it, it sounds like this. And that's still a nice sound, but the bit crushing just helps it a lot. I did something weird with the saws, where I have the saws of course, but you can see I have a melody on top of it, which is the same melody that's being played right here. And I did that just to kind of bring the melody out and make it more obvious. And you can hear it here as well. And then for the second half of the drop, what I wanted to do was kind of combine the first and second drops. And what I mean by that is you can hear the second drop, it's LFO'd a lot and it's very, it's very wavy. Whereas the first drop is not really LFO'd, it's just very straightforward. So what I did was, is I have this first little part which sounds like the second drop. And then I have this part which sounds more like the first drop. Because it isn't LFO'd. And that's pretty much it. I would go over the outro, but the outro is pretty much just me recycling stuff from other parts of the track, so you guys can probably gather what you want from it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That is my breakdown of Saunter. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something. And if you have any other questions, just leave a comment and I'll try to reply to all of them. And thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you later.